All right, good morning. Welcome back, week 4 already. Last week we spoke about physical constraints that affect movement. Well, this week you get the last piece of the puzzle, which is the informational constraints that are going to affect movement. When we talked about physical constraints, we said physical constraints are everything that occurs in the physical space. Well, when we talk about informational constraints, I want you to think of it, and I know it sounds a bit hippie, I said it before, but I want you to think of it as anything that constitutes energy. And by that I mean informational constraints can be visual perception, it can be auditory perception, it can be the friction of the ground that works on our body, etc. So think of it as different energy systems that occur around us. So what are we going to do is we're going to talk about how we use that energy and how that it constrains how we move about in space. We're going to focus specifically on visual constraints, briefly touch on haptic and acoustic constraints, and then finally discuss the importance of all of these sources of information. Now, this is the last piece of the puzzle, as I said, to understanding the constraints that approach the skill acquisition. Once you understand how this theory is different from the traditional theories, how physical constraints act upon our ability to perform motor skills, and how informational constraints act upon our ability to perform motor skills, you can apply the constraints that approach the skill acquisition. So when we talk about informational constraints, we sometimes talk about the environment and how the environment and the energy that's around us affects how we move about in space. And specifically, we're going to look at what's called interceptive actions. So our human ability to catch an object that moves towards us or moves somewhere in space and to catch it and intercept it at exactly the right time so we can grasp our hand around the object at exactly the right time is an amazing feature of the human body. And that's why we use it to describe some of these theories or the application of the constraints that approach the skill acquisition. So when we intercept an object, we have to coordinate relevant parts of our body, integrate that with sensory information, maybe even move our body into the right space, etc. So it's a hugely complex skill. On the other hand, when you think about something that's entirely different, like a surgeon making a very tiny incision, and they might use a computer for it, they might use their hands for it, then we can start thinking about how perception and information is going to affect how someone's going to perform a motor skill. Yeah, so it works for interceptive actions, but it works just as much for more fine motor skills like making micro incisions as a surgeon. So when we try to interact with our environment, we need to satisfy 3 different task constraints. Yep. So first of all, we need to ensure that we contact an object or surface at an appropriate moment in time. And that's what we call the timing component. Let's think about catching that ball. We have to make sure that we catch it at exactly the right time, or there's going to be no catching. Then secondly, we have to ensure that contact is made at the appropriate velocity. So we have to make sure that we move our limbs at the right velocity, but also when the ball is traveling at the right velocity. And then finally, we have to make sure that we make contact with that object at exactly or in exactly the right space. So we have to make sure that we account for that location component. So you take all of those 3 together, and that tells us that in order to perform such a complex skill like intercepting an object in space, we have to have really good quality information. And that's where informational constraints are very important for understanding how those informational constraints affect performance. Now, for those of you who remember, and others might know that from other topics, how did we describe our ability to integrate sensory information with a motor response? Can you remember we used one specific term for it? What? I think that's...
I can't connect at the moment. Try again in a little bit.
Thank you. She was trying to look up what I was asking you. That's AI right there. All right. So how did we call that? Integrating sensory information with a motor response. Does the term perception-action coupling say something? Yeah. So informational constraints are going to tell us something about how we integrate sensory information from the environment around us, and how we are going to use that to alter whatever action we are going to, or whatever motor response we are going to execute. Okay? So perception-action coupling. Now, think of it this way. When you're trying to catch this egg that someone is throwing at you, then you have to account for certain sources of information. The timing component for catching, whether you catch an egg or you catch a similarly shaped other object, the timing component is going to be similar. The kinematic component, however, is going to be vastly different. You're going to catch an egg with a different hand acceleration than you're going to catch a ball. And the location component is going to be the same. So the object that you're trying to catch, right, being the constraint, is going to influence the way that you are going to catch it. So that shows us that the ability to integrate sensory information, we see that it is an egg, we know that an egg breaks when you grasp it too firmly, is going to affect how we are going to catch that object. So we're constantly trying to navigate any motor skill that we do based on information in the environment that we perceive. And this is the basic definition of perception-action coupling, that there's a circular reciprocal relation between perception and action. And in other words, information from the environment has the ability to constrain action. So first of all, to understand how that information affects action, we have to revisit the concept of open systems. Remember in the very first lecture when we talked about open feedback loops and closed feedback loops? Yeah? This is not the same. Because when we talk about an open system, you have to think about it as an open skill. A skill in which continuously information is changing the way that you are executing that skill. So an open system basically constitutes of a constant change in the environment to which you have to react. So in other words, the perception-action coupling in an open skill is continuous. Something in the skill changes, you are adapting. Think about it as playing a game of soccer. If you're a central defender, based on how the opposition is running at you, how they are playing the ball, the speed with which they're running, you're continuously adapting your position to try and intercept the ball, for example. That's an example of an open system. And in an open system, individuals have to be really, really good at harvesting the information that occurs in the open system. In other words, if a defender knows where to look, where the most crucial part of information is in the environment, do we all agree that that would be a better defender? If he knows that when someone runs in a particular pattern, then the pass is going to go to the left, that's going to make it easier for me to intercept. And the whole reasoning behind information working as a constraint is saying that when you are better able to pick up that information and integrate it into a motor response, you are going to be or have a higher level of expertise. So with practice, individuals become consistently better at using and harvesting that information in the environment. Additionally, with practice, people also become more efficient. In other words, they need to use less information and expend less energy themselves in order to get the same result. And we'll talk about that in a second. When we think about it this way, is there anyone here who's ever walked a tightrope? No one? All right. Yeah, a little bit. So the very first time you walk a tightrope, you think, well, It's walking, right? I'm just going to walk the tightrope, and it's going to be the same as walking on land, but just, requiring a little bit more balance. But when you think about it, the amount of energy that you are going to expend trying to walk a tightrope for the very first time is huge. And that is because you are unable to harvest the energy, in this case, the frictional energy, and the sway of the rope. You are not able to harvest that energy and try to use it yet. You're trying to constantly fight it. And so in the beginning, when you're trying to learn a new skill, there's going to be a lot of information available. Information that's constantly varying and changing. But your ability to pick up the right information is not fine-tuned yet. Think about it this way. Someone who's an expert ice skater, they can do those triple axels and whatever they are 5-6 times in a row, and the amount of energy that they expend by doing it is very, very little. And that is because they harvest the energy that's in the environment. And so they use the low friction coefficient of the ice, they use a rotational component, they use inertia, etc. They use gravity in the right way, so they learn to use the environmental information so that they expend less of their own energy. Another, maybe much more clearer example is when you think about a goalkeeper. A goalkeeper stopping a penalty. For those of you who did motor learning and control, what does a good goalkeeper look at? Lower body. Yeah? So once a good goalkeeper knows where to look when someone is taking a penalty, they are much more efficient. They have to look at less environmental information, interpret less environmental information, and still get a better response. But a young goalkeeper, a very inexperienced goalkeeper, when they first start out, they look at all different types of sources of information. When you compare gaze behavior from young or inexperienced goalkeepers or elite goalkeepers fixate on 1 or 2 points for a very long time, while a novice goalkeeper is going all over the place, looking at the eyes, looking at the head, looking at the knees, looking back at the shoulders, looking at the hand, and so on. They're trying to look for information from the environment, but they are not being very efficient at it. While someone who's much more highly trained is more efficient, they know where to look so they can look at it for longer. Does that make sense, how we use environmental information that forces us to change our behavior? Yeah, somewhat? All right. So to understand better how informational constraints work, we have to explain 2 different concepts. The first one is the concept of variance and invariance in the environment, and the second one is the concept of affordances for action. And you will see this all sounds theoretical right now, but by week 12, you will all be applying it like you've never done anything else. Yeah? All right. So let's start from the premise that we are constantly and completely surrounded by energy. In this classroom, the energy is from heat, because it's quite warm here, but it's also me walking around, it's your classmates moving about, it's the light that's emitted by the screen, etc. We're constantly surrounded by energy, so by information. And our body's ability to pick up information is very, very good. Yeah? So imagine that you would pay attention and you would take up every single part of information that is in this room. Imagine how hugely inefficient that would be. Right? The moment someone sneezes, you're going, the moment someone breathes very loudly, you're going, huh, and then back to me. Imagine how inefficient that would be. So we have to somehow explain how individuals are able to focus on specific sources of information in the environment. And that's where the central nervous system comes in, and we'll see that in a bit afterwards. But the other thing is as well, that when we move about in space, let's say you are I've taken a Belgian as an example, obviously, as I do, but let's say you are what's that one called in English, where you do the 3 steps, the long jump? Sorry? Triple jump? Let's say you're a triple jumper, yeah? And you are running and you're going to take off, yeah? So for the first jump. We know that you're looking at that line and you're slowly changing the size of your steps So your foot matches exactly the area right before the line. But when you move yourself, that information constantly changes. Yeah, so it's not just looking at information in the environment, sitting still like you are doing right now, but it's actually moving about in the environment. Because you move about, the information constantly changes, and then reinterpreting that changing information. Yeah, that should slowly start to tell you how complex it is, or how complex our ability is to perceive information and execute motor responses based on that information. So those energy flows, that energy around us, and that is visual, auditory, sensory information, that energy around us, because we move about in space, that energy can be invariant or constant, or it can be variant or changing. A good example of that is if you imagine driving down this road. Okay? There are certain features in the environment that are invariant, for example, the horizon. But as you're moving about in space and you're passing cars that are parked on the side of the road, they're going to change size all the time. Yeah? There are going to be variants in the environment, cars on the other side of the road, etc. So as we move about in space, we take up information from variant sources and invariant sources. Another example of in this case, invariant sources. If you are a golfer and you're trying to putt the ball, yeah, then what a lot of golfers do is they move about the environment first, and they walk left a little bit, or they walk towards the hole, and they look back at where their ball is. They might duck down, stand up. And the reason for that is, not consciously of course, but the reason for that is that golfer is constantly trying to pick up invariant features in the environment. Why do you think it's so important for them to pick up invariant features? Yeah, exactly. And why specific invariant features? Exactly. It's stable, or it could be, it could be something in the environment that doesn't change. So once you understand the invariant features, executing that skill, all of a sudden, which was hugely complex and information is constantly changing, when you identify the sources of information in the environment that do not change, that is already a really big step towards being able to perform that specific skill. And so that is what a golfer does. And for those of you who haven't seen much golf, that's also what your hairdresser does. Because your hairdresser is cutting your hair, and they're walking to the side, and they're looking, and they're cutting again, and they're going back, like mine does. Ooh. And they're going a little bit here. So they're constantly changing because they want to see the invariance in your hair. They want to see what they still have to cut. And so our ability to interact with our environment is based on how well we are able to pick up invariance in the information, things that hardly ever change. And a way we do that is by using our optical array. And this again sounds like, we're part of Marvel's Defenders, but our ability to pick up information is hugely complex. And for example, what I mean by our optical array is everything that we can see in our field of vision. Now, the reason why I have someone sitting down or standing up here is because there's a few experiments that show that when you are sitting down and executing a particular skill, you execute it in a different way than when you're standing up. That is because the optical array changes. So our visual system, our optical array, can pick up those invariants in the information, and when it picks up invariants in the environment, then that gives us a better chance of executing a particular motor skill. Because straight away, the invariant structure that you need to execute that motor skill is revealed. Sounds abstract, but we'll get to it later. For those of you who've seen this before, bear with me for a second. For those of you who haven't done motor learning and control, I'll explain what I mean. There's one specific feature in our optical array that we need to talk about. And that feature in our optical array helps us to explain how we use that invariant information in the environment. And that's called tau. And when we talk about tau, what we're trying to say is tau tau is explaining us something about the time to contact of an object. Now, when you think about tau, a good way to think about it is you're crossing the street, standing at a crossing and trying to cross the street. The way that you use tau is you look to your right and you see whether or not a car is coming. That car is going to project an image on your retina, so the back of your eye, and that image is either going to increase or decrease. When it increases, the car is coming towards you. When it decreases, the car is going away from you. That makes sense, right? And we do the same thing with the ball. When we're trying to intercept the ball and catch it with one hand, all we're doing is looking at the rate of expansion of that ball on our retina. We're using our optical array to assess how fast that ball is going to come at us, and that means we can exactly close the hand at the right time. It's a simplistic overview of how we contact objects in the environment, but the best way to explain it is by using that optical variable tau. So, if an object has a constant velocity and is traveling towards us, there are several advantages of being able to explain how we interact with that object based on the optical variable tau. And one of the biggest advantages is, imagine this. Imagine we would actually compute how fast that ball is traveling towards us without optical variable tau. And we would have to say, oh, the increase in the ball size was just 0.1 millimeters. It's exactly X amount of centimeters closer to us because I think the object is flying at a rate of X meters per second. Imagine we would have to calculate all of that. That is hugely cumbersome. So what I'm trying to tell you is that our ability to perceive information from the environment is inbred. It is without calculation. It is born into us. Okay? So, in other words, when we use optical variable tau, individuals don't need to process information constantly. So there's no mental calculations of the object's time of arrival. And that's hugely beneficial, because that means we don't have to spend any time on processing that information. And specifically beneficial in very dynamic or fast-paced environments. We can imagine our ancestors running around on the plains trying to hunt bison, and it being hugely beneficial for them and to perceive whether an object was coming towards them or moving away from them. So over time, we gradually develop the ability to see whether or not objects are going to interact with us in time. And we fine-tune that, and now we're trying to use that in sports as well. This is an experiment that really explains how important tau is. And it's an experiment from a Dutch group. So in 1991, what this Dutch group did was they hung a ball on a pendulum. And the ball was released on the pendulum in a trajectory towards a person. And that person had to catch the ball with one hand. That was the task, right? But there were 3 different types of balls. One was small, 5.5 centimeters in diameter. One was moderately large, or large, 7.5 centimeters. And one was deflating from 7.5 to 5.5 centimeters. Now, we know, because of the optical variable tau, when a ball that has a diameter of 7.5 centimeters is swinging towards you, you are going to interact with it differently than when a ball that has a smaller size is moving towards you. And the reason why you're doing that is because you're using tau. You're looking at the projection of that ball on the retina and trying to intercept the ball at a particular time. But what if the size of that ball changes over time? What if it becomes smaller? Because, remember this, when a ball becomes smaller, it's trying to act opposite to how we use tau. Usually when a ball moves towards us, the projection of it becomes bigger on the retina. And we're very used to that. If it becomes bigger, it's almost there, we're going to have to interact with it. But if it swings towards us, but it is deflating and becoming smaller, does that actually trick our minds into using our hand in a different way? And what they actually saw is that when that ball was deflating and moving towards, when the ball was deflating and moving towards us, we were closing the hand at a later time. That means we were actually able to trick tau based on a deflating ball. And so that shows us that one of the most important ways in which we interact with our environment is by estimating time to contact, by using tau. And to translate that in more simpler terms, when we move about in our environment, we constantly use our optical array to look at how far objects are from us. And we use that information to navigate through our environment, whether that's while we're playing sports or while we're trying to cross a street or while we're doing other things. We constantly use visual information in our optical array, and that is going to constrain our action. Yep. Let's give you an example. Let's say you would hide some sweets that I love right over there. Yeah? And there's one other person in this lecture room that loves those sweets as well. You place them there, and I'm here. And we have to run as quickly as possible through all the rows and end up over there. Imagine how our optical array constantly has to change or constantly has to tell us how to change our behavior. I'd be running between these rows and someone would stick their legs out. My optical array would tell me there's an object, it's closing in on you or it's coming closer, it's time to jump. Our optical array, while I'm moving about in this space, different people are sitting everywhere. I'm constantly having to change my behavior based on what I see, what is in my optical array. And the reason why I can do that is because I don't have to calculate anything to do so. If I would have to calculate, I would have to, all right, legs are about 10 centimeters tall. I've seen that before. If I jump about 25 centimeters high and 40 centimeters long, I won't hit their legs. All right, that's what I'll do. Imagine the other person using tau, and me using the mental calculations. Yeah? How will I ever get a BMI of 35 if I never get to those sweets? Okay? So what I'm trying to tell you is that the way to think about informational constraints is the energy flows, the information in the environment that you are picking up that change the behavior that you're executing, change the motor behavior that you're executing. Right. And a way to understand how our information or informational constraints change behavior is by using the term affordances. So neurobiological systems, such as ourselves, such as other animals, neurobiological systems perceive information by what it offers, invites, or demands from us in terms of motor action. So in other words, I'm running through the lines, running through the rows. Someone has their legs up here. Okay? Based on the information I see, I'm going to think about which motor behavior could overcome or use that information. And that's what's called affordances. Okay? What response is afforded based on the information? For example, when you run on different surfaces, okay? You're running around on different surfaces, you're going from grass to cobblestones to a hard surface. While you're running, your ability to perceive that information is going to change how you run or which kind of movement you're going to use to run on cobblestones, soft ground, or hard ground. Think about it this way. First run on hard ground, then the cobblestones are nearing you. Tau is telling me that I'm almost there. When you run on cobblestones, what a lot of people do is they never put their feet in the grooves. And they're constantly manipulating the size of their step to land exactly on the right place. This is not OCD. This is actually what people do when they try to navigate objects, especially on uneven surfaces. You're always trying to put your foot in exactly the right place. We're not doing it constantly, but the information that we perceive affords this type of action. For those of you who are existentialists, that does not mean that you don't have your own decisions, but it just means that we're constantly using environmental information that changes our behavior. Another example of affordances in action is an approaching ball. Let's say you're playing squash with someone, and the ball lands here. Based on how high the ball bounces, or how low the ball bounces, you might use a drive or a lob. Yes, the moment you see or you perceive information in your optical array, that is going to change the next part of motor behavior that you're going to execute. And to understand a constraints-led approach, we can say that this is going to differ whether you're at the beginning of the game, later in the game, you've got a good opponent, a bad opponent, whether you're feeling good, whether you're feeling particularly creative, etc. Yeah, so what we perceive in the environment is constantly changing how we are choosing an appropriate motor response. Yeah. So those invariants in the environment that we talked about before and affordances are going to lead to decision making on which movement we are going to perform. So information that we perceive is available all the time. And we interpret a lot of that information. But as we practice more, and this is the constraints-led approach to skill acquisition, as we practice more, someone is better able to pick up the right information that's going to lead to a different or a change in motor pattern. Let's take the example of the goalkeeper again. Okay? If the goalkeeper looks at someone's eyes while they're taking a penalty, or the head, well, we know there is no relevant information, that is not an affordance for action. It is not going to change how someone is going to stop a ball or not. Yeah? So once you become more skilled, you're going to get better at using that information, using invariant information, and using affordances. And that's a theory behind a constraints-led approach from an informational perspective, and a constraints-led approach to skill acquisition. A good example of that is, there was it was anecdotal, but some interviews with expert coaches and expert players. And they asked the players, you know, when you're playing basketball, what are the things you look at? And a lot of the basketballers said that one thing that they learned over time was to look at their opponent's gaze behavior. And what that means is, when basketballers are playing basketball, yeah, they can't look 360 degrees behind them. Yeah, they're not owls. They can't turn their head, or the exorcist, they can't turn their head all the way around. Yeah? So in order to get that 360 degree view, what they do is they look at where their opponents behind them are looking. And they know, or after a while, as they became more and more expert, they knew that relevant information was in where the opponent was looking. And particularly, yeah, in free throws, for example, the opponents are looking at where other available teammates are to make a breakaway. And so a lot of these basketball players used opposition's gaze behavior to see where information was behind them. And that clearly demonstrates the importance of relevant environmental information. They know where to look because it affords a particular action. Yeah? All right. So we've introduced what informational constraints are. And we've introduced what you have to think about when I talk about information in the environment. We've also talked about how that information and particularly invariant features of that information afford action. Now, we'll look deeper into information movement or information action coupling. And a good way to describe information movement coupling is by using the moving room experiment. Again, for those of you who've already seen it, bear with me. This is for the others. The moving room experiment, and I've been in one of those moving rooms, and it is impressive. The moving room experiment is an experiment that was done where someone was placed inside a room, not too dissimilar with this one, but with two walls on the side. The front wall is painted like a zebra, black and white stripes. Yeah? The participant is standing here, and what is happening is the wall of the room is on a hinge. It can move forward or it can move backwards. Okay? So what they do is they move the front wall of that moving room, they move it forward abruptly. And they look at what the difference is or what the postural response of a participant is that stands in that room. Now, if visual information or information we perceive in our optical array wasn't that powerful, then nothing would happen because we would perceive straight away that there was no real difference or the room wasn't actually moving. We would know that straight away. But our visual information is so powerful and so overruling of all other sources of information that when that wall moves towards you, you automatically take a step back. Right? And in fact, babies actually fall over when the room moves towards them because obviously perception-action coupling is less developed in babies or in infants than it is in adult people. So this moving room experiment shows that there is a coupling between what we perceive and the action we choose to, or not even choose, the action we execute. Okay, so it's a good example of what perception-action coupling is. In response to that original study by the Dutch scientists with the deflating ball, there was a different study, and that study was mainly, we're not going to discuss the results specifically, but that study was mainly done because from the 1991 study, Sabelsberg and colleagues said tau is the most important source of information that we use when we interact with our environment. And there are almost no other sources of information that we need. And these scientists said, oh, wait a second. We believe that there are many other sources of information that we constantly perceive that we're also using as affordances for action. And so what they did was they had the same conditions, but they also made an inflating ball, not a deflating ball. And they saw that, in fact, when they used the inflating ball, they were again able to manipulate someone's ability to time and grasp a particular ball. And they said, because of that, tau is not the only source of information that is used. And other informational sources must also play a role. And one of those sources of information, they said, is hand control. And what they basically said is that our visual system is, or our ability to perceive visual information is even more complex than we originally thought. You're not just using tau, but you're matching tau with the acceleration of your hand when you're trying to intercept an object. Yeah? So what they said was that when you give someone the task of catching different balls, and those balls are coming from different angles. Yeah? So in other words, this ball will, sorry, I don't have a pointer, so it doesn't make any sense. But the middle ball will take a different amount of time to reach you than a ball on the side, for example. They saw that participants were able to intercept those balls in different ways because they were using different velocities and accelerations of the hand. Yeah, so in other words, they said that we're not just using tau to intercept that ball, but we're also using information on how our body is moving in space. So in summary, what can we say about that case study of how we intercept objects and what it says about how we use informational constraints? Well, first of all, invariants, mostly, and some variants in the optical array change how we are going to intercept an object. And so invariants and variants in the environment are important. Specifically, we pick up those invariants and we use them as affordances, remember? We use them as affordances for action. And then finally, perception-action coupling can be learned or is a result of expertise and is very susceptible to practice. So you can teach someone to interact with an object much better. You can teach someone to run through these rows of chairs and navigate objects much better. Perception-action coupling is trainable. All right. So where does that come from? Where does our ability to perceive sensory information come from? We're not going to talk about brain structures, etc., but there is one particular important thing that you need to know, and that is that in our brain, we interpret visual information in two different ways. One stream of information is everything that allows us to perceive action, and the other stream of information allows us to perceive different objects. Now, again, that sounds abstract now, but let me show you with an example. This is called the Ebbinghaus illusion, and there's another illusion called the Muller-Lyer illusion. Muller-Lyer, I think. Yeah, Muller-Lyer. Sorry, Muller-Lyer illusion. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion, and the best way to describe that we have two different streams of how visual information reaches the central nervous system is using this illusion. In this illusion, which of the objects is largest in size, A or B? Which of the middle circles? A? Yep. Automatically, that is what we perceive because the surrounding circles are smaller. Yeah, but in fact, you all know it's called an illusion. Yep. Disk A and disk B are exactly the same size. So after a while, when you ask people, look at this illusion, tell me if A and B are the same size, after a while, they figure it out. They say A and B are the same size. Okay? But, A and B are different. That is what they say in the beginning. So when you first show this illusion, they say A and B are different. But when you make this an object, imagine a ball that is shaped exactly like this illusion, and you make it move towards people, they are going to use a different grip or a different timing of closure of the hand in the top than in the bottom figure. And that shows you that even though someone perceives those, they are going to use the same. Now I'm confused. Yeah? So even though someone perceives those discs as being different, when they are thrown at you and you have to try and catch them, you treat them as exactly the same. Your grip is going to close at exactly the same time. And that shows us that there's two different ways of interpreting that information. And remember, perception of action and object perception. Object perception tells you they are different. Perception of action says they are the same. If there were no dorsal and ventral stream, there would be no difference in either perceiving or acting upon this object traveling towards you. So, in other words, and this shows you again what affordances are, the way that we interpret visual information is based on what we intend to do with it. And it adds another layer of complexity to how we use that visual information in the environment. We're not just perceiving, we're perceiving based on what we want to do with that information. Affordances for action. All right. So we've talked about sensory information from optical array, visual information, but we can quickly go over some haptic or touch information and some acoustic information. And one really good way of explaining how we use haptic information is by using the wielding of implements. And a good way to think about that is, when a tennis player is ready to receive a serve, they're always turning the racket around. So what those tennis players are actually doing is they are sensing the haptic information in that tennis racket. And therefore, we can say that wielding that implement before helps, or this is what they report at least, wielding that implement before twisting the racket around helps in returning a serve better. And that is because when we know the weight and the size and how an object feels in the hand, we are much better able to use it. The haptic information is an affordance for action. So far as haptic information, not that important. All you have to know is that while wielding an implement, you use that haptic information to afford action. Acoustic information is also important, and acoustic information is sometimes superior to visual information when you're going to learn. And we saw that last semester, but for those of you who haven't seen that, imagine having to learn a dance routine without acoustic information. That would be nearly impossible. while with acoustic information and no visual information, you can still learn the routine. Or swimmers who use pacers in their ear to time their swims, for example, or the frequency of their strokes, or studies in which the sound of the ball contact of the racket and the ball in table tennis change the behavior of the opponent, etc. Yeah? So acoustic information, just like visual information, just like haptic information, is an affordance for action. And there's a few studies I put out there just so you could have a look. But one of them is when no auditory information is available while playing table tennis, performers actually perform a lot worse than when acoustic information is available. So that shows us that acoustic information is an affordance for action. Based on the sound that the ball contact makes when the opponent hits the ball, you're going to select a slightly different stroke. Yep, so acoustic information is an affordance for action. Last one. Yep. And then also was a confounding factor in many experiments was the sound that the ball machine made. So in a few experiments, participants afterwards were asked, how did you determine where the ball was going to land? For example, experiments on a volleyball serve and assessing where that volleyball serve was going to land was based on the sound the ball machine made. So in other words, the spin of the ball or the sound of the ball machine told them something about where the ball was going to land. So we use acoustic information as well as visual, as well as haptic information. Now, in summary, and this is the last piece of the puzzle, and trust me, you had to do it last semester. Trust me when I say that those pieces of the puzzle will come together in the next weeks, and you'll start understanding how they all apply to a constraints-led approach. So we said that information is everywhere. We're constantly trying to perceive it, and when we're perceiving it, we're constantly trying to change our action based on it, and we call that perception-action coupling. Therefore, perception and action should not be viewed independently. And when you do your assessments, I'm expecting you to never see them separately either. Perception and action are intertwined in perception-action coupling. And then third, humans constantly use various sources of information, not just visual information, not just acoustic, not just haptic, but we also know that they use proprioceptive information. And we're constantly integrating all of that sensory information to generate one single motor output. And you have to keep that in the back of your mind. The ability for you to change one of those constraints, informational constraints, is easy. You can easily change the amount of acoustic information someone gets, visual information, but you have to know that the moment that you change one part of that information, the resulting movement or the resulting action is going to change as well. Yeah, and that's the constraints-led approach to skill acquisition. You manipulate the constraints, you determine the action. You manipulate the constraints again based on which action they do, and the action changes. Yeah? And you will see over time that as you get better at understanding those constraints, you get better at changing someone's behavior based on how you, as a coach, as a practitioner, as a clinician, change the constraints that afford action. All right? Any questions? Good. If there are, I'll be waiting outside. You can always ask me there. All right. Thank you.